The boy who cried wolf. There was once a young boy named Thomas who lived in a small village nestled between rolling green hills and thick forests. Thomas was 10 years old, with messy brown hair that never seemed to stay combed, bright curious eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. He lived with his grandmother in a cozy cottage at the edge of the village, where flowers grew wild in the garden and birds sang from the apple trees every morning. Thomas loved his grandmother very much, and she loved him too, even though sometimes he could be a bit mischievous. Every day during the warm months, Thomas had an important job. He would take the village sheep up to the hillside pasture where the grass was greenest and sweetest, and he would watch over them all day long to make sure they were safe. The villagers trusted Thomas with this task because taking care of the sheep was one of the most important responsibilities in their small community. The sheep provided wool for warm clothes and blankets, milk for cheese, and they were like members of every family in the village. Thomas felt proud when the villagers gave him this job, and he promised them he would be the best shepherd they had ever seen. At first, Thomas truly enjoyed his work. He would wake up early in the morning when the sun was just peeking over the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He would eat the warm breakfast his grandmother prepared for him, usually oatmeal with honey and fresh berries, and then he would gather the sheep and lead them up the winding path to the high pasture. The sheep knew Thomas and trusted him, following behind in a fluffy white line, bleating softly to each other as they walked. Once they reached the pasture, the sheep would spread out and munch on the sweet grass while Thomas sat under an old oak tree, watching them carefully and making sure none wandered too close to the forest edge. But as the days went by, Thomas began to feel something he hadn't expected. He began to feel lonely. The hilltop was beautiful, with wildflowers swaying in the breeze and butterflies dancing from blossom to blossom, but there were no other children to play with, no one to talk to except the sheep, and they weren't very good at conversation. Thomas would watch the clouds drift by overhead and try to imagine shapes in them. He would practice throwing stones at a target he made from sticks. He would sing songs his grandmother had taught him. But still, the hours felt long, and the loneliness felt heavy. One afternoon, as Thomas sat watching the sheep and feeling particularly bored, a thought crept into his mind. It was a thought that seemed exciting at first, though if he had stopped to think about it more carefully, he might have realized it wasn't a very good thought at all. Thomas thought to himself, "What if I called for help? What if I shouted that a wolf was attacking the sheep? Then all the villagers would come running up the hill, and I would have people to talk to, and it would be exciting instead of boring." The more Thomas thought about this idea, the more appealing it seemed. He pushed aside the tiny voice in his head that whispered this might not be right, and before he could change his mind, he jumped to his feet and cupped his hands around his mouth. "Wolf! Wolf!" Thomas shouted as loudly as he could. "A wolf is attacking the sheep. Help! Please help!" His voice echoed across the valley and reached the village below. Thomas watched with growing excitement as doors flew open and people came running out of their houses. He saw the blacksmith drop his hammer and sprint up the hill. He saw the baker wipe flour from her hands and hurry toward him. He saw farmers leave their fields and mothers scoop up their youngest children before racing to help. Within minutes, it seemed like the entire village was rushing up the hillside, carrying sticks and tools, ready to fight off the wolf and save their precious sheep. When the villagers reached the top of the hill, breathing hard from their run, they found Thomas sitting calmly under the oak tree with the sheep grazing peacefully all around him. There was no wolf. There was no danger. Everything was completely fine. Thomas tried to hold back his laughter, but he couldn't help himself. He burst out giggling at the sight of all the grown-ups standing there, confused and out of breath, looking around for a wolf that didn't exist. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, though he was still laughing. "I was just joking. There's no wolf. I just wanted some company." The villagers were not amused. Thomas's grandmother, who had hurried up the hill along with everyone else despite her aching knees, looked at him with disappointment in her eyes. The blacksmith shook his head slowly. The baker frowned. "Thomas," his grandmother said in a voice that was gentle but firm, "what you did was not a joke. We were all terrified. We thought you and the sheep were in real danger. We dropped everything we were doing to help you." The other villagers murmured in agreement, and Thomas could see that they were upset. But even though he felt a little bit sorry, he also felt excited by all the attention and the commotion he had caused. The villagers eventually walked back down to the village, returning to their work, but Thomas could hear them talking among themselves, and he knew they were disappointed in him. For a few days after that, Thomas behaved himself. He watched the sheep carefully and didn't call for help unless he really needed it, which he didn't because no wolves actually came near the pasture. But then the loneliness crept back in, and with it came the memory of how exciting it had been to see everyone running up the hill, how thrilling it had felt to be the center of attention, even if only for a little while. Thomas knew what he had done before was wrong, and he knew the villagers had been upset with him, but somehow those things didn't seem as important as the boredom he was feeling right now. So one afternoon, about a week after the first incident, Thomas made the same terrible choice again. "Wolf! Wolf!" he shouted, even louder than before. "Please come quickly. A wolf is after the sheep." And just like the first time, the villagers heard his cries and came running. They ran even though their legs were tired. They ran even though they had so much work to do. They ran because they cared about Thomas and about the sheep, and because helping each other was what their village had always been built on. But when they reached the hilltop, gasping for breath and ready to protect the flock, they found the same scene as before. Thomas was sitting there with a sheepish grin on his face, and all the sheep were perfectly safe, munching grass without a care in the world. This time, the villagers were more than disappointed. They were angry. Thomas's grandmother's face went pale, and she looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Thomas," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "you lied to us again. You made us believe you were in danger. Do you understand what you've done?" The blacksmith stepped forward, his face stern. "We trusted you with an important job, Thomas. And we trusted that when you called for help, you really needed it. But you've broken that trust twice now." The baker added, "What will happen when you really do need help? How will we know if it's real or just another one of your jokes?" Thomas felt his smile fade away. For the first time, he truly understood that what he had done was serious. He saw the hurt and anger in the faces of people who had always been kind to him, people who had run up a steep hill twice because they cared about him and wanted to protect him. He felt ashamed, and the shame sat heavy in his chest like a stone. But even though he felt bad, a stubborn part of him didn't want to admit just how wrong he had been. He mumbled an apology that didn't sound very sincere, and the villagers walked back down the hill once more, shaking their heads and talking in low voices about trust and responsibility and how disappointed they were. That evening, Thomas's grandmother made him his favorite dinner, which was chicken pot pie with flaky crust and vegetables from their garden. But the food tasted like dust in his mouth because he could see the sadness in his grandmother's eyes, and it made him feel terrible inside. After dinner, she sat down beside him and took his hands in hers. Her hands were wrinkled and soft, and they had held him when he was a baby and comforted him through every scraped knee and bad dream he'd ever had. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I need you to understand something very important. Honesty is like a bridge between people. When you tell the truth, you build that bridge strong and sturdy, and people can trust you to walk across it safely. But when you lie, you damage that bridge. And if you lie too many times, the bridge can collapse completely, and then nobody will be able to trust you anymore, even when you're telling the truth." Thomas looked down at his hands in his grandmother's gentle grip. "I'm sorry, Grandma," he whispered, and this time he meant it. "I won't do it again. I promise." His grandmother kissed his forehead and said, "I believe you want to keep that promise, dear one. But wanting to do something and actually doing it are two different things. You'll have to prove to everyone that you can be trusted again, and that will take time." Thomas went to bed that night feeling worse than he had ever felt before, but he was determined that tomorrow would be different. He would be the best shepherd the village had ever seen, and he would never, ever lie again. The next morning, Thomas led the sheep up to the pasture with a new sense of purpose. He watched them more carefully than he ever had before, walking around the flock every so often to make sure they were all accounted for and safe. He noticed things he had never paid attention to before, like which sheep liked to wander away from the group and which ones stayed close together. He learned their different bleating sounds and started to recognize each sheep as an individual, not just part of a fluffy white crowd. The day passed peacefully, and Thomas felt good about how responsible he was being. When he brought the sheep back to the village that evening, his grandmother smiled at him with pride, and that smile made Thomas's heart feel warm. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas continued to take his job seriously. He stopped feeling so lonely because he had learned to appreciate the quiet beauty of the hillside and the gentle company of the sheep. He watched hawks soar overhead and rabbits hop through the meadow. He learned to identify different bird songs and to predict the weather by watching the clouds. He discovered that being alone with his thoughts wasn't such a terrible thing after all, and that responsibility could actually feel good when you took it seriously. The villagers began to smile at him again when he passed them in the street, though he could tell they were still watching him carefully, wondering if he had truly changed. Then one afternoon, about a month after Thomas had made his second false alarm, something happened that changed everything. Thomas was sitting under the oak tree, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a bird, when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a low growl coming from the edge of the forest, followed by the frightened bleating of sheep. Thomas's head snapped up, and his heart began to pound in his chest. There, emerging from the shadows of the trees, was a real wolf. It was bigger than Thomas had imagined a wolf would be, with gray fur, yellow eyes, and teeth that gleamed white in the afternoon sun. The wolf was moving slowly toward the flock, its body low to the ground, stalking its prey. For a moment, Thomas was frozen with fear. His mind went completely blank, and all he could do was stare at the wolf and the terrified sheep scrambling away from it. But then his training took over, and he remembered what he was supposed to do in exactly this situation. He jumped to his feet, his legs shaking, and he opened his mouth to call for help. "Wolf!" he shouted, his voice cracking with genuine terror. "Wolf! There's a real wolf! Please help! This time it's real!" He shouted as loudly as he could, putting all his fear and desperation into his voice, hoping that the villagers would hear him and believe him and come running like they had before. But down in the village, the people heard Thomas's cries, and they stopped what they were doing and looked at each other with doubt in their eyes. The blacksmith heard the shouting and shook his head, returning to his forge. "It's just Thomas playing his tricks again," he muttered. The baker heard the cries and sighed, kneading her bread dough a bit more vigorously. "That boy needs to learn that lying has consequences," she said. One by one, the villagers heard Thomas's desperate calls for help, and one by one, they dismissed them as another false alarm. They had been fooled twice before, and they weren't going to fall for it a third time. They went back to their work, believing that Thomas was crying wolf yet again. Up on the hillside, Thomas kept shouting until his throat was raw and his voice was hoarse, but nobody came. He looked frantically between the wolf, which was now circling closer to the sheep, and the village below, where he could see people going about their business as if nothing was wrong. Tears streamed down his face, and he felt more afraid than he had ever been in his life. But beneath the fear, there was something else. There was regret so sharp it felt like a knife in his chest. He understood now, truly understood what his lies had cost him. He had broken the villagers' trust so completely that now, when he really needed help, when the danger was real, nobody believed him. Thomas knew he couldn't just stand there crying. He had to do something, even if he was just a boy and the wolf was big and fierce and dangerous. He picked up his shepherd's staff, which he had carved from a strong branch of oak wood, and he started waving it at the wolf, shouting and making himself as big and loud as possible. He remembered his grandmother telling him once that wolves were often scared of things that seemed bigger and braver than they actually were. Thomas ran toward the wolf, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst, and he yelled with all his might. He banged his staff against rocks and trees, creating as much noise as he possibly could. The wolf stopped and looked at Thomas with those terrible yellow eyes. For a long moment, boy and wolf stared at each other, and Thomas thought his legs might give out from pure terror. But he kept shouting and kept waving his staff, and slowly, the wolf backed away. It wasn't afraid of Thomas exactly, but the noise and commotion were making it uncertain, and there were other, easier prey to be found elsewhere. The wolf turned and slunk back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows as quietly as it had come. Thomas stood there shaking, his staff still raised, until he was absolutely certain the wolf was gone. When the danger had passed, Thomas sank to his knees in the grass, trembling all over. The sheep gradually calmed down and went back to grazing, but Thomas couldn't stop crying. He cried not just because he had been so frightened, but because he realized how close he had come to losing the sheep because of his own foolish mistakes. He cried because he understood now, in a way he never had before, that trust was precious and fragile, and once you broke it, putting it back together was one of the hardest things in the world. He stayed there on the hillside until the sun began to set, thinking about everything that had happened and everything he had learned. When Thomas finally brought the sheep back to the village that evening, he went straight to his grandmother's cottage. She took one look at his tear-stained face and his trembling hands and pulled him into a tight hug. Thomas told her everything. He told her about the real wolf and how he had shouted for help and nobody had come because they didn't believe him anymore. He told her how he had faced the wolf alone and scared it away. And he told her how sorry he was, not just for today, but for all the lies he had told before. His grandmother held him and listened to every word, and when he finished she said, "I'm proud of you for being brave today, Thomas. And I'm proud of you for finally understanding why honesty matters so much." The next day, Thomas asked his grandmother if he could speak to all the villagers. She helped him gather everyone in the village square, and Thomas stood in front of all these people he had known his whole life, people who had watched him grow from a baby to a boy. His hands were shaking and his voice was quiet at first, but he spoke from his heart. "I need to tell you all something," he said. "Yesterday, a real wolf came to the pasture. I called for help, but nobody came, and I understand why. It's because I lied to you before. I lied twice and I broke your trust. I thought it was just a joke, but I was wrong. I put the sheep in danger. I put myself in danger. And worst of all, I hurt all of you by making you think you couldn't believe me." Thomas took a deep breath and continued, "I learned something important yesterday. I learned that honesty isn't just about telling the truth when it's easy. It's about building trust with the people around you day by day, word by word. And I learned that once you break that trust, it's really hard to get it back. I'm sorry for what I did. I know saying sorry isn't enough, but I promise you that from now on, I will always tell you the truth, even if the truth is hard, even if the truth makes me look bad. I will never lie to you again, because I understand now how important it is that you can trust me." The villagers listened quietly, and Thomas could see different emotions crossing their faces. Some looked angry still, some looked sad, but some, like his grandmother, looked proud. The blacksmith was the first to speak. "Thomas," he said in his deep, rumbling voice, "thank you for being honest with us now. But you're right that words aren't enough. You'll have to show us through your actions that you've really changed. It will take time for us to trust you again." The baker nodded in agreement. "But," she added with a small smile, "everyone deserves a chance to make things right. We'll be watching, Thomas. Show us that you mean what you say." And that's exactly what Thomas did. Every single day for the rest of that summer and into the fall and winter, Thomas proved through his actions that he was trustworthy. He watched the sheep carefully every day. When other children in the village asked him to skip his responsibilities and play instead, he said no and explained why his job was important. When he made mistakes, which everyone does sometimes, he admitted them right away instead of trying to hide them or lie about them. When villagers asked him questions, he always told them the complete truth, even when the truth was embarrassing or made him look foolish. Slowly, over many months, Thomas rebuilt the trust he had broken. It wasn't easy, and there were times when he felt frustrated that people still seemed to doubt him. But he kept going, kept being honest, kept showing up and doing his job well. And gradually, he saw the villagers' attitudes toward him change. They started smiling at him again, real smiles that reached their eyes. They started asking his opinion about things related to the sheep. They started trusting him with other small responsibilities around the village. The bridge of trust that had collapsed was being rebuilt, plank by plank, truth by truth. One spring morning, almost a year after the incident with the real wolf, Thomas's grandmother called him to the porch where she was sitting with her morning tea. "Thomas," she said, patting the seat beside her, "I want to tell you how proud I am of you. You made a mistake, a serious one, but you learned from it. You took responsibility. You changed your behavior. And you never gave up, even when earning back trust was hard. That takes real courage and real character." Thomas felt warmth spread through his chest, the kind of warmth that comes from knowing you've done something truly good and worthwhile. "Grandma," Thomas said thoughtfully, "I understand now why you always told me that honesty was so important. It's not just about not getting in trouble or following rules. It's about being someone that other people can count on. It's about being part of a community where everyone takes care of each other. And that only works if we can trust each other. When I lied, I didn't just hurt myself. I hurt everyone." His grandmother nodded wisely and squeezed his hand. "That's exactly right, my dear boy. And now you know that lesson in your bones, in a way you never could have learned just from me telling you. Sometimes our mistakes become our greatest teachers, if we're willing to learn from them." As Thomas grew older, he never forgot the lessons he learned that summer. He became known throughout the village as someone whose word could be trusted absolutely. When he said he would do something, people knew he would do it. When he told them something, they knew it was true. And because he had learned his lesson so well and so deeply, he taught it to other children in the village, not through lectures or scolding, but through his own example and by sharing his story honestly when the moment was right. Years later, when Thomas was grown with children of his own, he would take them up to that same hillside where the old oak tree still stood. He would tell them the story of the boy who cried wolf, but he wouldn't tell it as a tale about someone else. He would tell it as his own story, including all the parts that made him look foolish and all the parts that were hard to admit. And his children would listen with wide eyes, and they would understand that honesty wasn't just a rule to follow but a gift to give to the people you loved. They would understand that trust was something precious and powerful, something worth protecting and worth rebuilding when it broke, no matter how hard that might be. The old oak tree where Thomas had sat as a boy still stood on the hillside, and sometimes Thomas would sit beneath it and think about all the years that had passed. He would think about the scared, lonely boy he had been, the boy who thought a lie was just a harmless joke. And he would think about the man he had become, a man who understood that every word you speak, every promise you make, every truth you tell or don't tell, builds or breaks the connections between you and the people in your life. He learned that in a world that could sometimes be harsh and uncertain, being someone others could trust was one of the most valuable things you could ever be. And that, Thomas knew in his heart, was the most important lesson of all. Honesty builds trust, and trust builds communities, and communities build lives worth living, where people take care of each other and nobody has to face their wolves alone.